Thanks, guys. I am Nicole Clark. I am the CEO and co-founder of Trellis, which is a legal data and analytics company. And before I jump into our talk today, which is on diversity and inclusion, first I'd like to share a little story and give you a little context on who I am, so you can see sort of the context and the lens through which I see diversity and inclusion. So I grew up in LA. I'm an only child, lower income family. I left home and moved to the East Coast at 16, and I started college early. I decided to go to law school. I got married. I got divorced. I had a baby. I practiced on the East Coast for a number of years, and then I moved back to LA. And I took the bar while I had a young infant, and ultimately I began practicing at a large litigation boutique. And so for the first couple of years while I was an associate, I'm not going to say that I hid the fact that I had a baby, but it wasn't something that I advertised. And I think that I just really didn't want to be judged by partners. I felt like they were already probably assuming that I was going to get married and I might take time off for a child, and that they might put less time into sort of nurturing me as an associate and helping me rise through the ranks. And I just wanted the same opportunities that my male counterparts had. And at some point, I decided that I didn't care anymore. And so I put pictures of my baby up all over my office, and one day, a male partner came into my office, and he looked at me, and he looked at the pictures on my wall, and he said, "You don't have a baby." He didn't ask me, he told me. And I just remember the look on his face. It was sort of as if he had created this idea of the perfect mold of this associate that he was expecting. And the fact that I had a child just didn't fit in with that, and he couldn't compute. And I remember the way that that made me feel. And shortly after that, I remember talking with one of the female equity partners at the firm. And she pulled me aside and she told me that very early on in her career, she had made a choice between being a successful attorney and having a family. And I could feel that she resented me for sort of marching into the firm with my naivete and throwing her life choice in her face by really thinking that I could have it all, that I could have both. And it was around that time that I started to really feel like there was no sort of long-term path forward for me in law. From there, I moved to a couple of different firms. I went to firms that touted themselves as lifestyle firms and learned that what that actually means is you work just as hard, but they pay you less. And after doing that a few times, I realized, oh, hey, it's not the firm that's the problem. There are systemic problems in the profession that are creating this environment. And so I really continued to feel like a career in law just wasn't sustainable. I could look around at the partnership level and I saw a lot of white men. And there were a few women, and then as you got into equity partners, even fewer women, but equity partners with young children, there were none. And so I didn't see people who looked like me, who had my experiences, that were able to reach the level of success that I wanted. And I think that I really started to lose hope. And for those of you out there that are employers, this is a really critical moment. This is what you don't want. You don't want young, talented employees either to not accept a position or to leave your company because they don't see hope for achieving success because they don't see people that look like them. So how bad is diversity in legal? Well, let's look at the numbers. So the American Bar Association reported in 2018 that 85% of lawyers in the US were white, about 36% identified as female. These numbers are getting slightly better. If we look back to 2007, women only made up 30% of the legal profession. But in terms of private practice specifically, breakdown of attorneys by gender gets worse and worse the more you get into senior roles. So while women make up 48% of summer associates, and in fact, my law school class, we were slightly over-indexed. I think we were 52% female. We make up only 45% of associates, and then only 20% of partners. And when you get to the equity partner level, the numbers are abysmal. Additionally, women law partners face a whopping 53% gap in pay at top US law firms. 53%, I mean, that's massive. And then the numbers for female minority lawyers, it gets worse and worse. Only 4% of active attorneys identify as Black, and only 4% identify as Hispanic or Latino. So how is this happening? What is causing this great chasm in diversity in law? First, let's talk a little bit about the difference between diversity and inclusion. So someone described diversity to me as being asked to the dance, and inclusion as being asked to dance. So diversity is really the what, and inclusion is the how. Diversity focuses on the makeup of your workforce and demographics, such as gender, race, age, sexual orientation, whereas inclusion is really a measure of culture that enables that diversity to thrive. And what are some of the obstacles to achieving diversity? Well, these include things like unconscious bias, like diversity fatigue, and like diverse employees being unable to get a sponsor or a champion. So first, let's talk about unconscious bias. So as humans, we all have prejudices, we all make assumptions. A lot of times, these assumptions are not grounded in reality. Nevertheless, these assumptions tend to influence our attitudes, they can change and shape our behaviors, and they can be incredibly difficult to change, particularly if we don't recognize them. So really, that first step is to identify the prejudice and assumptions and to recognize them. Now, you guys might be saying to yourselves, that's not me, right? I'm committed to diversity, I'm committed to equality. You might be surprised to find out that 70% of people who took a test where they self-identified as not seeing race or gender and being pro-equality ended up testing positive for unconscious bias in Harvard's implicit association test. And this is a test which measures attitudes that people may be unwilling or unable to report themselves. So bottom line, we all have unconscious bias, and the key really is to recognize it. Next is inability to get a sponsor or a champion. So a sponsor is going to be a senior level leader who is going to elevate their protege's visibility within a company to key stakeholders, who's going to advocate for key assignments and promotions, and really sort of put their reputation on the line for the protege or the mentee's advancement. Studies have shown that lack of sponsorship will increase someone's likelihood of quitting within their very first year at a job. And then finally, diversity fatigue. So diversity fatigue is a process where progress has stalled out because people are simply tired of talking about diversity and inclusion. It can be really frustrating. They hear a lot of talk, and that ends up not really turning into impactful action. And it can be overwhelming, just the sheer number of issues that we face. And with diversity fatigue, I actually have to constantly check in with myself and say, am I actually walking the walk? An example of that I can give is I often catch my own unconscious biases. So my company, Trellis, we mine trial court data, we analyze it, and we allow litigators to research how their trial court judge rules on specific issues. And then we also provide judicial analytics on a range of important pretrial motions. And when I'm talking about judges, I tend to always use the male pronoun. So I say, he tends to deny 72% of motions to strike, or he grants, 64% of MSJs. And someone pointed this out to me recently, and they were right. Now, I can blame it on the fact that the majority of the judges that I appeared before were male. And as you can see from the numbers, it's sort of accurate, right? You have a 3 times higher likelihood that the judge you appear before is going to be male. But if I rely on the current makeup of a profession that has a history of instances of discrimination and prejudice against diverse individuals, and these range from denying admission to the bar, revoking or refusing bar association membership, all the way to discriminating in hiring and judicial appointments, then if I did that, that would really sort of abdicate my own responsibility for reinforcing gender stereotypes, as well as my own recognition of how powerful language actually is. So instead of hiding behind current evidence of discrimination in the makeup of our court system, I can instead take responsibility for my own action and my language, and I can start to do some counter-stereotyping when I'm discussing judges, which actually has proven to be quite effective in mitigating unconscious biases. Now, next you might be asking yourself, why does this matter? Why does diversity matter for your business? Why does it matter for your practice? Well, a 2018 study showed that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 21% more likely to generate greater profit than their competitors. Companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity were 33% more likely to generate more profit than other companies. Recent research shows us that companies that are more diverse actually perform better financially. So bottom line, diversity and inclusion really does deliver commercial gains. When employees feel that their organization is diverse, they're 83% more likely to agree to share diverse and innovative solutions. They're 31% more likely to meet the needs of the customer, and they're 42% more likely to work collaboratively. In fact, inclusion is even linked to higher personal and individual performance ratings. So it has a huge effect. Now, all right, we've talked a little bit about diversity in legal. Let's talk about diversity in tech. We're at a legal tech conference here. So let's see, starting when computer technology first emerged during World War II, and this continued in through the 1960s, women actually made up most of the computing workforce. By 1970, that had dropped to only around 13% of degrees in computer science, and the numbers have continued to get worse and worse. And what ends up happening is we create an incredibly homogenous male industry and an incredibly male employee pool, which leads to pipeline issues where it's difficult to bring diverse candidates in for job interviews. And then when you do bring them in, it's difficult to get them to accept because they look around your company and they don't see a lot of people that look like them. They look around leadership and they don't see people that look like them. And then in addition to making it difficult to hire a diverse talent pool, it's also much more difficult to get funding for your tech company if you aren't a white male. So in 2018, all of the female founders put together received $10 billion less in funding than one male-run company took in by itself. So I think that's a pretty good demonstration of how hard it is out there. Only 2% of the $130 billion in venture capital ends up going towards women-run companies. 2%. For women-run companies like Trellis, I can tell you firsthand that raising money, particularly institutional venture capital, as a female founder is incredibly difficult. Now, we're an outlier in that we were able to take in venture capital, but one of the reasons that it is so hard is because if you think about it, what VCs are actually doing is they're pattern matching. And for them, the instances of success that they look at, they see a lot of young male Stanford dropouts that have gone on to have huge unicorn successes. And because women historically haven't been able to bring in institutional capital, they aren't able to create the type of high growth companies that are very capital intensive in their early years. And so it makes it difficult to demonstrate those successes that VCs would then be able to pattern match off of. And I can tell you that when I was raising our funding, that every VC meeting that I went into, across the table, it was entirely male. And I knew that when VCs looked at me, they did not see the pattern of the unicorn founders that they were used to seeing. And really, in VC, it has a very similar glass ceiling to legal. There might be a fair amount of sort of junior associates or analysts, but when you get into female general partners that are actually making funding decisions, there are very, very few and far between. And beyond that, I would say in fundraising, I experienced diversity fatigue myself. I heard a lot about women supporting women and women funding women, but when it came down to it, it really felt like just talk. I didn't see women really putting their money where their mouth was, and all of the talk felt really exhausting to me. So what can we do? Well, we can all take small steps. We can start to make our working environments more inclusive. Right now, 61% of women and minorities report that they feel uncomfortable at work. Basically, like they have to bend themselves out of shape in order to fit in. So we really need to start creating a more inclusive culture. And one of the things you can do is start by making unconscious bias training mandatory at work. In California, where Trellis is headquartered, AB 241 and AB 242 recently passed, and this actually makes implicit bias training required for all judges and court personnel in the state. What else can we do? We can acknowledge our coworkers for who they are, humans. We can bridge differences, and we can step up to support people when they're at risk of being excluded. Creating an inclusive culture means making fair decisions about people, appreciating people for who they are, and particularly for their different perspectives, because it's these different perspectives that are actually going to drive innovation at your company. So this means building connections with people who would otherwise see themselves potentially as separate. Additionally, we can develop and support internal programs at our organizations that really focus on mentorship for diverse employees, sponsorship and championing, making sure that the leadership team does reflect diversity, and really creating sort of work and family policies that promote loyalty and promote inclusion. And I will say that it's incredibly important for senior leadership to buy in on this. You've just got to get their buy-in, because diversity and inclusion is a top-down process. So for me at Trellis, that means that I'm responsible for the makeup of my team. And I can tell you firsthand that it is difficult. So I look at my team and I say, in some ways, we're crushing it. We have individuals from 3 different companies, 5 different nationalities, diverse sexuality, disabilities. But I do see one area that I'm falling short. I don't have enough women on my team, right? Here I am talking to you guys about all of the difficulty that I faced in being a female attorney and in getting funding and in feeling included. And my team does not have enough women. On that note, if any of you guys know some rock star female engineers, come find me. But it really is my responsibility at the end of the day. So for each of you, the level of diversity and the inclusive culture within your firm or within your business, just like for me, that's going to fall on you. And I know that it can feel overwhelming. But really, if we each take small steps, ultimately a lot of small drops can create a huge wave. So I'm here saying that I know it's not easy, but I do know that change starts with us, with each and every one of you in this room, and that diversity and inclusion is our responsibility. Thank you. And if we have extra time, I'm more than open to do any Q&A. Sure. It's true. I think it's definitely part of it. I think there's a lot of instances where women do end up leaving the workforce, and that companies take into consideration the fact that they may have an employee who's ultimately going to go out who they either have to replace or foot the bill for. And so there is a lot of implicit sort of bias and assumption in there in I should probably hire more males because then I have a greater likelihood that this person is going to stay here and work harder. And what ends up happening, of course, is the woman tries to re-enter the workforce, come back to a firm. She's off partnership track. She's given part-time, often contract work. And there's no way to sort of get back onto the track that you were originally on. And I don't know that there's an easy fix for this. I don't know that I have the answer for it. But I know that part of that assumption that you're going to lose women to family life is a problem. There's no question. It's doing damage. Hmm. Yes. Mm. I think that's a great start. And there's a lot of companies that are starting to do better paternal leave situations and are starting to sort of recognize that raising a child isn't necessarily a maternal thing and that it does require often two parents and providing for that. But yeah, I think it continues to be an issue, definitely. Sure. Yep. Absolutely. So one of the things in the wage gap between men and women is also the fact that a lot of the practice areas where women tend to really practice heavily in are areas that just generally bring in less money for the firm, or the firm allocates less money for, and that's going to be things particularly like labor and employment, and generally doing a lot of the grind, difficult motion work that's also going to be seen as less valuable to the firm than being out bringing in clients, which often you'll see the male partners out to lunch doing that. And yeah, there absolutely is a correlation with the types of law that women end up doing and the lower wages that are associated with those practice areas. Yeah, I think it's only starting to be something that's talked about. It depends on the firm. Obviously, some firms are doing better than others. It's very much a firm by firm basis right now, which is why it really depends on leadership to be pushing through policies and practices which are going to be beneficial to everybody. Thank you. Yep. I think there are a few things. There's really a couple things that lead women to end up raising less capital than men. One is we're more realistic. We have an actual expectation of what we think we can accomplish, and we tell it instead of going into a VC and having the moonshot of, I'm going to have a billion-dollar company, being totally unrealistic. Unfortunately, the VCs tend to respect that distortion of reality, and so that's one thing that's difficult. Another thing is the types of companies that women tend to start oftentimes are smaller areas or smaller markets where the VCs say, that's not going to give me my 100x return that I am betting that one of the 10 companies in my portfolio is going to get. And so even though it might be a great business, it's not a big enough market for us. So there's a couple of things like that. And then when you just get into general public speaking, there's so much about general sort of sociolinguistics, about the way that women have been trained to react to in conversations, what we do, and the way we speak, how loud we speak, how fast we speak, the tone. And all of that has been shown to affect the way that you're perceived by VCs as whether you're confident, whether you're going to be able to achieve this. So I think there's a couple things. I think we're going after a very large market with, we're incredibly ambitious in what we're trying to achieve and going after all trial court data. But beyond that, I think there's unfortunately an element of luck. And I don't think people talk about this, but it takes really hard work, but it also takes luck. And I would say that I worked really hard and then also got in front of people at the right time. Anything else? All right, thank you guys.